Just days before one of the most important NATO gatherings of the year, something unexpected happened. Donald Trump picked up the phone and spoke with Vladimir Putin for nearly 90 minutes. There were no cameras, no joint press conference, and no dramatic announcement afterward. But for diplomats across Europe, that single conversation immediately raised a much bigger question. What was so important that it couldn't wait until the NATO summit? Because this wasn't just another phone call. It came at a moment when the war in Ukraine remains unresolved. Relations between Russia and the West are still deeply strained, and every major decision now carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. So, was this the beginning of a diplomatic breakthrough? Or simply another move in a much larger geopolitical chess match? To understand why this conversation has captured global attention, we first need to understand what was happening behind the scenes before the call ever took place. To understand why this conversation attracted so much attention, we first need to look at the timing. This wasn't just another diplomatic phone call placed on an ordinary day. It happened at a moment when multiple geopolitical pressures were building at the same time. The war in Ukraine has now entered another critical phase. Russia continues to push for military gains while Ukraine keeps seeking greater military and financial support from its Western partners. At the same time, European leaders are becoming increasingly concerned about the long-term security of the continent. And just around the corner, NATO leaders are preparing to meet for another high-stakes summit, a gathering where military strategy, defense spending, and the future of support for Ukraine are expected to dominate the agenda. That alone would have made this an important week. But then came the unexpected phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. According to officials, the conversation lasted for nearly 90 minutes, far longer than a routine diplomatic exchange. While neither side released every detail of what was discussed, both acknowledged that the leaders spoke about the war in Ukraine, the state of U.S.-Russia relations, and the possibility of future diplomatic engagement. And that's exactly what caught the attention of analysts around the world, because in international politics, timing is often just as important as the words themselves. When two of the world's most influential leaders choose to speak privately, just days before a major NATO summit, governments don't simply ask what was said. They ask something even more important. Why now? Was this an attempt to test the possibility of renewed negotiations? Was it an effort to reduce tensions before world leaders gathered in the same room? Or was each side simply trying to strengthen its position before the next round of diplomatic discussions began? At this stage, no one outside that conversation knows every detail. But one thing is already clear. This call wasn't important because it produced an immediate breakthrough. It was important because of what it may reveal about the direction of global diplomacy in the weeks ahead. And to understand that, we need to take a closer look at what each leader may have been trying to achieve. To understand why this conversation matters, it's important to remember one thing. In geopolitics, leaders rarely make high-level calls without a strategic reason. Every conversation sends a message. Sometimes that message is meant for the person on the other end of the line, and sometimes it's meant for the rest of the world. For Donald Trump, the timing was especially significant. Throughout his presidency, he has repeatedly argued that prolonged wars come at an enormous cost, not only in lives, but also in economic resources, military commitments, and global stability. He has often said that diplomacy should play a larger role in ending major conflicts, even with countries that have difficult relationships with the United States. Whether people agree with that approach or not, it has remained a consistent part of his foreign policy message. Speaking directly with Vladimir Putin was therefore consistent with that broader strategy of keeping diplomatic channels open, even during periods of intense disagreement. But from Moscow's perspective, there were strategic considerations as well. Russia remains under extensive Western sanctions, while the war in Ukraine continues to place significant pressure on its economy, military resources, and international relationships. Although Russia has maintained important partnerships with countries such as China, India, and several nations in the global south, its relationship with the United States still carries enormous geopolitical weight. Any sign of renewed dialogue between Washington and Moscow immediately attracts global attention, not because it guarantees change, but because it suggests that communication has not completely broken down. And that's an important distinction. Diplomatic conversations are not the same as diplomatic agreements. A phone call doesn't end a war. It doesn't remove sanctions. And it doesn't erase years of mistrust between two nuclear powers. But history has shown that major geopolitical shifts often begin with something much smaller than a treaty. They begin with communication, That is why analysts around the world paid close attention to this conversation, not because anyone expected an instant breakthrough, but because even limited dialogue between Washington and Moscow has the potential to influence military decisions, diplomatic negotiations, financial markets, and the calculations of America's allies. And nowhere were those calculations more important than in Europe. Because while Trump and Putin were speaking privately, NATO leaders were preparing for one of their most closely watched meetings in recent years. While Washington and Moscow were speaking behind closed doors, another group of leaders was watching the situation just as closely: Europe. For European governments, the outcome of the war in Ukraine isn't simply a foreign policy issue, it's a matter of regional security. Since the conflict began, many NATO members have increased defense spending, expanded military cooperation, and committed billions of dollars in economic and military assistance to Ukraine. Those decisions have reshaped defense budgets, energy policies, and long-term security planning across the continent. That's why any high-level conversation between the United States and Russia immediately attracts attention in European capitals. Not because Europe expects one phone call to change everything, but because diplomacy between major powers can influence the direction of future negotiations. If communication between Washington and Moscow becomes more frequent, European leaders will naturally want to understand what that could mean for NATO's strategy, continued support for Ukraine, and the broader security architecture of Europe. At the same time, Ukraine is closely watching every diplomatic signal. For Kyiv, continued international support remains essential. Military aid, financial assistance, intelligence sharing, and political backing have all played significant roles throughout the conflict. Any discussion involving two of the world's most influential leaders inevitably raises questions about how future negotiations or future military decisions could evolve. But there's another dimension that often receives less attention. Geopolitical events don't only affect governments, they affect economies. Whenever tensions rise or even begin to ease, financial markets, energy prices, defense industries, and investors around the world pay close attention. A single diplomatic development can influence expectations about sanctions, international trade, energy exports, and overall market confidence. That's why analysts don't judge these conversations only by what leaders say. They also watch how governments respond, how markets react, and whether diplomacy eventually leads to concrete policy changes. Because in international politics, perception itself can shape decisions. Sometimes, simply reopening a line of communication changes the strategic calculations of every country involved. And that's exactly why this 90-minute conversation generated headlines around the world. It wasn't necessarily about what happened during the call. It was about what might happen next. So the real question isn't whether Trump and Putin spoke. The real question is whether this conversation marks the beginning of a larger diplomatic process, or whether it will ultimately become just another chapter in a conflict that still has no clear end. Beyond the political headlines, there's another reason why this conversation matters: the global economy. Whenever the leaders of two major powers engage in direct diplomacy, governments aren't the only ones paying attention. Financial markets are watching, energy companies are watching, defense manufacturers are watching, and investors around the world are trying to understand what could happen next. That's because geopolitics and economics are deeply connected. If diplomatic tensions begin to ease, even slightly, markets often start reassessing the future. Could sanctions eventually change? Could energy exports become more stable? Could global trade routes become less vulnerable to geopolitical uncertainty? On the other hand, if diplomacy fails and tensions continue to rise, governments may increase defense spending. Businesses could delay investments and energy markets may remain volatile. None of these outcomes are guaranteed, but they are exactly the kinds of possibilities that policymakers and investors consider after high-level diplomatic contacts. This is why a single phone call can generate attention far beyond Washington and Moscow. It influences expectations. And in global markets, expectations often shape decisions long before policies actually change. For America's allies, the conversation also raises an important question. If diplomatic engagement between Washington and Moscow becomes more frequent, how might that affect future security commitments, defense strategies, and economic planning? At this stage, there are far more questions than answers. But one thing is certain: the world isn't simply watching what leaders say, it's watching what they do next. Because in geopolitics, today's conversation can become tomorrow's policy. In the end, the significance of this phone call isn't measured by the number of minutes it lasted, it's measured by what it represents. At a time when the war in Ukraine continues with no clear resolution, when relations between Russia and the West remain deeply strained, and when the world is becoming increasingly divided by competing strategic interests. Even a single conversation between Washington and Moscow becomes more than just another diplomatic event. It becomes a signal that communication, despite years of confrontation, has not completely disappeared. Of course, no one should assume that one phone call can suddenly end a war. Diplomatic breakthroughs usually take months, sometimes years. And many important conversations never produce an agreement at all. But history has repeatedly shown that major geopolitical changes rarely happen overnight. They often begin with quiet discussions long before the world sees the final outcome. Whether this conversation eventually leads to renewed negotiations, influences future decisions at NATO, or simply remains another diplomatic exchange, only time will tell. For now, governments around the world will continue watching every meeting, every statement, and every diplomatic move that follows. Because in today's geopolitical landscape, actions are important. But timing is often even more important. I'm Daniel Chen. Thank you for watching WestGlobal News. If you enjoy in-depth geopolitical and economic analysis that goes beyond the headlines, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next report.